Tonight, we tell you a story that sounds impossible, a story that historians will study for generations, a story about a man who drove a bus through the streets of Caracas and ended up driving an entire nation into the ground. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is the documented, verified, undeniable trajectory of one man's journey from anonymity to absolute power, from union organizer to international pariah. From Hugo Chávez's quiet protege to one of the most sanctioned human beings on planet Earth. His name is Nicolás Maduro. And tonight we're going to break down exactly how he rose, exactly how he ruled, and exactly why his grip on power is finally, after years of brutality, beginning to crack. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a biography. It's a warning, a case study in how democracies die. Kura. And perhaps most importantly, a story that is still being written as we speak. Let's start where every dictator's story becomes most revealing, not at the height of their power, but at the beginning. Before the palace, before the military salutes, before the speeches broadcast to millions. In 1962, Nicolás Maduro Moros was born in Caracas, Venezuela, to a working-class family. His father was a union activist, his mother a homemaker. There was nothing in his early years that suggested he would one day control the largest oil reserves on the planet. And nothing that suggested he would oversee an economic collapse so severe that citizens would lose an average of 24 pounds from starvation. Nothing that suggested he would be accused of crimes against humanity by the United Nations. Nothing at all. As a young man, Maduro was unremarkable. He attended high school but never graduated. He never attended university. He never earned a professional degree of any kind. Instead, he found work where he could, and for years that work was driving a bus. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would become Venezuela's authoritarian ruler, the man who would defy the United States, imprison journalists, and allegedly order security forces to fire on protesters, spent his formative years behind the wheel of a metro bus in Caracas. This detail matters. Not because there is anything wrong with honest work, but because it reveals something crucial about Maduro's rise. He didn't climb through merit. He didn't rise through intellectual achievement. He rose through loyalty, absolute, unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to one man. And that man was Hugo Chávez. To understand Maduro, you must first understand Chávez. And to understand Chávez, you must understand Venezuela in the 1990s. By the late 1980s, Venezuela was a nation in crisis. Despite sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, wealth inequality had reached staggering levels. The political establishment was seen as corrupt, out of touch, and serving only the elite. In 1992, a young military officer named Hugo Chávez attempted a coup against the government. He failed. He was imprisoned, but something remarkable happened during his arrest. He was allowed to give a brief television statement. In that statement, Chávez said the coup had failed for now. Those two words, por ahora, became a rallying cry. They suggested this was not the end. They promised he would return, and return he did. After his release from prison, Chávez rebuilt his movement. He channeled popular anger against the establishment. He promised to redistribute oil wealth to the poor. He promised a Bolivarian revolution that would transform Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chávez was elected president of Venezuela in a landslide victory. And watching from the shadows, learning everything, was Nicolás Maduro. Maduro had joined Chávez's movement years earlier. As a young union activist, he had been drawn to leftist politics. He became involved in revolutionary groups. He traveled to Cuba for political training. And when Chávez began building his movement, Maduro was there. Not as a leader, not as a strategist, but as a loyalist. Someone who would do whatever was asked, someone who never questioned, someone who waited. And Chávez rewarded that loyalty. First, Maduro was elected to the National Assembly in 2000. Then he was appointed foreign minister in 2006. And finally, in 2012, the position that would change everything, Vice President of Venezuela. By this point, Chávez was dying. Cancer was consuming him. He had traveled to Cuba repeatedly for treatment. And he knew he needed a successor, someone who would continue his revolution, someone who would never betray his legacy. He chose Maduro, not because Maduro was the most capable, not because Maduro was the most charismatic, but because Maduro was the most loyal. And in Chávez's final calculation, loyalty mattered more than competence. That calculation would prove catastrophic for Venezuela. On March 5, 2013, Hugo Chávez died. He was 58 years old. Venezuela plunged into mourning. Millions took to the streets. And Nicolás Maduro, the former bus driver, became acting president. 1 month later, Maduro won a special election by the narrowest margin in Venezuelan history. Just 1.5 percentage points. The opposition demanded a recount. They alleged fraud. International observers raised concerns. But Maduro held power, and he would never let it go. What followed was a masterclass in authoritarian consolidation. Not overnight, not dramatically, but piece by piece, institution by institution, Maduro dismantled Venezuelan democracy. He packed the Supreme Court with loyalists. He stripped the opposition-controlled National Assembly of its powers. He created a parallel legislature filled with his supporters. He arrested opposition leaders on charges that international observers called politically motivated. He took control of the military by promoting loyalists and purging critics. He took control of the media by shutting down critical outlets and harassing journalists. He took control of the economy by expanding state power over private businesses. And through it all, he maintained one crucial fiction, that he was a Democrat, that elections were fair, that Venezuela remained free. The evidence said otherwise. By 2014, Venezuela was beginning to collapse. Oil prices had fallen sharply, and the Venezuelan economy, dependent on oil for over 90% of export revenue, cratered. But this wasn't just bad luck. This was mismanagement on a staggering scale. Chávez had used oil wealth to fund social programs that were popular but unsustainable. He had imposed price controls that created shortages. He had nationalized industries that then failed. He had printed money to cover deficits, triggering inflation. Maduro inherited these problems, and then he made them worse. Instead of reforming the economy, he doubled down on Chávez's policies. Instead of addressing shortages, he blamed them on sabotage and hoarding. Instead of accepting responsibility, he blamed the United States, Colombia, and shadowy capitalist forces. The results were catastrophic. Inflation that was already high became hyperinflation. By 2018, inflation reached 1 million%. That is not a typo, 1 million%. The currency became worthless. Savings evaporated overnight. The minimum wage couldn't buy a single meal. Shortages that were already severe became absolute. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Supermarkets ran out of food. Parents watched their children go hungry. Venezuelans began eating from garbage, and then came the exodus. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since Maduro took power. 7 million. That is nearly a quarter of the entire population. It is one of the largest displacement crises in modern history, larger than Syria, larger than Ukraine. They fled to Colombia, to Peru, to Ecuador, to the United States, anywhere they could escape the collapse that Maduro had engineered. And as his people starved and fled, Maduro dined on live television. He ate empanadas while mocking his critics. He gained weight while his citizens lost an average of 24 pounds. He lived in luxury while children died in hospitals without medicine. This was the reality of Maduro's Venezuela. So, a petrostate transformed into a failed state, an oil-rich nation reduced to desperate poverty, a democracy converted into a dictatorship, and the world was watching. International response came in waves. First, condemnation. The Organization of American States condemned Maduro's authoritarian moves. The European Union expressed concern. Human rights organizations documented abuses. Then, sanctions. The United States imposed targeted sanctions on Maduro and his inner circle. Assets were frozen. Travel was banned. Financial networks were cut off. Then, recognition withdrawal. In 2019, after Maduro claimed victory in an election widely seen as fraudulent, opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself interim president. Over 50 countries, including the United States, recognized Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. For a moment, it seemed like Maduro's fall was imminent. Protesters filled the streets. Military defections seemed possible. International pressure was mounting. Guaido stood at the gates of power, backed by the world's most powerful nations. But Maduro held on. He held on because the military stayed loyal, bound to him by corruption and fear. He held on because Russia and China continued providing support. He held on because Cuba sent security advisors who knew how to maintain authoritarian control. He held on because holding on is what survivors do. And Nicolás Maduro, whatever else he may be, is a survivor. By 2020, Guaido's challenge had faded. International attention had moved on. The COVID pandemic consumed global focus, and Maduro remained in power, weakened but unbroken. He adapted. He began allowing limited use of the US dollar, easing some of the currency crisis. He quietly allowed more private sector activity. He made tactical concessions that relieved pressure without surrendering control. And he waited, patient, calculating. But then came 2024, and everything changed again. Venezuela held a presidential election in July 2024. Maduro claimed victory with 51% of the vote. But the opposition said their candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had actually won by a landslide. They published voting tallies showing Gonzalez with over 60% of the vote. The Carter Center, one of the few international observers allowed access, stated the election did not meet international standards and could not be considered democratic. Independent analysts found overwhelming evidence of fraud. Protests erupted across Venezuela. Security forces responded with force. Dozens were killed. Thousands were arrested. Opposition leaders went into hiding or fled. But this time, something was different. This time, the evidence of fraud was so overwhelming that even allies hesitated. Brazil's Lula, a leftist who had previously maintained ties with Maduro, refused to recognize the results. Colombia's Petro, another leftist ally, called for new elections. Maduro was more isolated than ever. And then the United States made its move. In early 2025, the Trump administration announced it would not accept Maduro's fraudulent election. They recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the legitimate president of Venezuela. They increased sanctions. They seized Venezuelan state assets. They put a $25 million bounty on Maduro's head for alleged drug trafficking. And they began applying pressure unlike anything Maduro had faced before. This is where we stand tonight. A dictator who rose from nothing, who consolidated power through patience and brutality, who survived crisis after crisis after crisis, now facing perhaps his greatest challenge. His economy remains shattered. His people continue to flee. His international support has narrowed to Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. His own citizens openly defy him, despite the risks. And the man who once drove a bus through Caracas now drives a nation into an uncertain future. So what happens next? Intelligence analysts are divided. Some believe Maduro's grip remains strong enough to survive indefinitely. The military is loyal. The security services are effective. The opposition is fragmented. Others believe the 2024 election marked a turning point. The fraud was too obvious. The documentation too thorough. The international consensus too unified. What everyone agrees on is this: Venezuela's crisis is far from over. Over 7 million refugees cannot return until there is change. The economy cannot recover until there is reform. The nation cannot heal until there is accountability. And accountability would mean confronting everything Maduro has done. The political prisoners, the extrajudicial killings, the torture documented by the United Nations, the starvation of a nation. For Maduro, accountability is not an option. It is a death sentence politically and possibly literally. He will cling to power because the alternative is unthinkable, and that is what makes this moment so dangerous. A cornered dictator with nothing to lose is capable of anything. Tonight, as we consider the arc of Nicolás Maduro's life from bus driver to dictator, from Chávez's shadow to international pariah, we are watching a story that history has told many times. The story of how ordinary men become tyrants. The story of how democracies die not with a single blow, but with 1,000 cuts. The story of how loyalty without competence, power without accountability, ideology without pragmatism leads to catastrophe. Venezuela was once the richest country in Latin America. It had more oil than Saudi Arabia. It had a functioning democracy while much of the region suffered under military rule. It had hope. Maduro took that hope and crushed it. Not alone. Chávez began the process. Corruption enabled it. Geopolitics complicated it. But Maduro completed it. And now perhaps we are watching the beginning of the end. Or perhaps we are watching another false dawn, another moment of hope that will fade into continued darkness. Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. The man who drove a bus through Caracas has driven his country off a cliff. And whether he falls with it or somehow survives again will determine the fate of 30 million Venezuelans. This story is far from over, but tonight, you understand it. You understand it. You understand how it happened. You understand what it means. And you understand what comes next will matter, not just for Venezuela, but for every nation that believes democracy is worth defending. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're covering every major development in this story as it unfolds. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand what's really happening in Venezuela. And drop a comment below. Do you think Maduro will survive? Or is this finally the beginning of the end? I read every comment, and I want to hear your analysis.